January 17, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The sun had not yet burned away the morning mist when the first Japanese Type 95 Hago tanks churned across the coral sand of Roinamur Island. Inside the lead tank, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto gripped the commander's periscope with hands that had stopped trembling only after the third cup of sake the night before. The metal was already hot to the touch. Through the narrow vision slit, he could see palm trees reduced to blackened stumps, their fronds scattered like the bones of ancient creatures. The bombardment from the American fleet had turned the island into something biblical, a landscape of craters and ash where nothing lived except the men who refused to leave. Yamamoto had been assured this would be different from Tarawa. The intelligence reports delivered to his unit 3 weeks prior spoke of American reluctance to adapt, of doctrine-bound officers who followed their manuals like scripture. The Type 95 was light. Yes, barely 7 tons of riveted steel, but it was designed for infantry support in China, where peasant armies carried bolt-action rifles and fled at the sight of armor. Here, the enemy was different. Yamamoto knew this. Every tanker in the Imperial Japanese Army knew this. Yet the orders came down unchanged, as if the nature of war could be frozen in time by the will of Tokyo alone. What Sergeant Yamamoto could not know, was that 300 yards ahead a 19-year-old Marine from Oklahoma named Private James Keller was already abandoning the doctrine he'd been taught at Camp Pendleton. The Japanese Empire had built its armored doctrine on speed and moral superiority. The Type 95 Hago tank was a philosophy rendered in steel, a machine that reflected Japan's strategic reality in the late 1930s. With a 37mm main gun and armor no thicker than 50mm at its strongest point, it was never meant to duel other tanks. It was meant to terrify Chinese infantry, to crush Manchurian resistance, to serve as a mobile pillbox supporting infantry advances across the vastness of the Asian continent. In those campaigns, it had succeeded brilliantly. The sight of tanks, any tanks, had been enough to break formations that had never faced mechanized warfare. But the Pacific was not China. The Americans were not the Chinese. And by January 1944, this truth had been written in blood across a dozen islands from Guadalcanal to Tarawa. Yet, institutional momentum is a force as powerful as any naval bombardment. The Japanese tank crews of the Marshall Islands had received their training in Manchuria, their tactics refined in the open plains of northern China. The manual they carried, printed in 1938, spoke confidently of rapid exploitation and shock action through speed. It did not speak of bazookas. It did not speak of Marines who had already adapted 3 times to Japanese defensive tactics, who shared lessons in informal networks that moved faster than any official doctrine. The Americans had learned to be afraid during the first year of the war. They had learned respect for Japanese infantry tactics at Guadalcanal, where enemy soldiers seemed to materialize from the jungle itself. They had learned the cost of frontal assaults at Tarawa, where the coral reef forced landing craft to discharge Marines into chest-deep water under withering fire. Each lesson had been purchased with blood. Each lesson had been incorporated not through official channels, but through the desperate innovation of men who understood that survival required evolution. By the time the 4th Marine Division landed at Kwajalein, they carried weapons their training manuals barely acknowledged. The M1A1 bazooka had been in service for less than 2 years. The M2 flamethrower was so new that spare parts had to be cannibalized from damaged units. Yet every squad had men cross-trained on both. Every corporal had listened to veterans from Tarawa describe how to angle the bazooka shot against a pillbox, how to brace for the backblast, how to reload in 4 seconds while someone else provided covering fire. This knowledge flowed through cigarette breaks and chow lines, through the terror bond of men who knew they would die if they did not learn faster than their enemy. Sergeant Yamamoto's tank crossed the first line of shell craters at 647 hours. Behind him, 3 more Type 95 seconds followed in textbook formation 50 meters apart, maintaining visual contact, turrets traversing in coordinated arcs. The rumble of their diesel engines echoed across the dead coral. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the heat was already unbearable. The radioman, a boy of 17 from Kyoto, pressed his headset against his ear and repeated the company commander's orders with mechanical precision. Advance to phase line blue. Engage enemy infantry at distance. Do not overextend. These were good orders, sensible orders, orders that would have worked perfectly in Manchuria in 1939. They did not account for what was about to happen. Private Keller crouched in a crater that still steamed from the naval bombardment 8 hours prior. His hands worked automatically checking the M1A1 bazooka's breech, ensuring the rocket was properly seated, wiping coral dust from the primitive site. Beside him, his loader, a machinist from Detroit named Kowalski, held 2 more rockets ready and whispered a steady stream of profanity that served as prayer. They had not been ordered to this position. They had not requested permission. They had simply seen the tactical problem, an open approach perfect for armor, and moved to solve it. This was the adaptation that Japanese intelligence had failed to predict. Not better weapons, though the Americans had those, not superior armor, which they also possessed, but rather a fundamental difference in how decisions were made. Japanese tank doctrine assumed that orders would flow from company commanders to platoon leaders to individual tanks, that each level would execute its prescribed role, that adaptation would occur between battles, not during them. American doctrine, particularly as practiced by the Marines in early 1944, assumed that every rifleman was responsible for solving the tactical problem in front of him, that corporals could make decisions that would have required a lieutenant's approval in any other army, that survival belonged to those who moved faster than the enemy's decision cycle. When Yamamoto's Type 95 reached the center of the killing ground, Keller fired without waiting for the order that would never come. The rocket struck the tank's frontal armor at a 90-degree angle, penetrating the 15mm plate as easily as a knife through rice paper. The explosion inside the crew compartment lasted less than 2 seconds. The screaming lasted longer. The Japanese had expected the Americans to be formidable. This was not arrogance, but rather a calculated assessment based on industrial capacity and naval power. What they had not expected, what their entire cultural and military framework could not easily accommodate, was the speed of American tactical evolution. Japanese doctrine treated the soldier as part of a collective organism, each component performing its designated function with precision and discipline. This approach had conquered Manchuria and humbled China. It had brought Singapore to its knees and sent the British fleeing through Burma. But it was a system designed for victory, not adaptation. The Type 95 HAGO became a symbol of this doctrinal rigidity. After the first tank brewed up in Keller's kill zone, the remaining 3 tanks in Yamamoto's platoon did exactly what their training demanded. They continued to advance, not because the crews were suicidal or stupid, but because the alternative required breaking formation, abandoning the phase line, requesting new orders, and waiting for approval from company headquarters. The doctrine that had served them so well in China paralyzed them in the Marshall. They advanced because the manual said advance. They maintained formation because the manual said maintain formation. And one by one, they died because the Marines they faced had already thrown away the manual in favor of what worked. By 710 hours, all 4 tanks were burning. 28 men dead. 0 American casualties in the immediate engagement. The disparity was so stark that the company commander, reviewing the action reports that evening, assumed his subordinates had inflated their claims. He had not. The truth was simply difficult to accept, that an enemy who had seemed so terrifying, effective 18 months ago, could now be defeated with such one-sided efficiency. But for the men inside those tanks, the final moments were not statistics or tactical lessons. They were heat and smoke, and the realization that everything they had been taught was wrong. Yamamoto survived the initial bazooka hit, thrown clear when the turret blew off. He lay in the coral sand for 40 seconds before a corpsman found him, not to provide aid, but to ensure he posed no threat. In those 40 seconds, Yamamoto understood with perfect clarity what his superiors in Tokyo still denied, that the Americans were not fighting the war Japan had prepared for them. They changed their tactics faster than Japanese intelligence could track them, that every engagement fed into a machine of adaptation that grew more efficient with each iteration. The Americans had found something the Japanese could not counter, not superior fighting spirit, which Japan possessed in abundance. Not better individual soldiers, which was arguable, but rather a system that allowed every level of command to observe, adapt, and implement new solutions without waiting for approval from above. A private with a bazooka could kill a tank without asking permission. A squad could abandon its assigned position to set up a better ambush without court-martial. A battalion could rewrite its tactics between morning and afternoon based on what worked during the previous assault. In the weeks that followed Kwajalein, Japanese tank units across the Pacific began receiving new orders. Armor was to be dug in, used as stationary pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. The Type 95 would not charge across open ground anymore. It would wait, hull down, hoping that American Marines would walk into its killing zone before the bazookas found their mark. This was adaptation of a sort, but it was reactive, defensive, an admission that the initiative had been lost. The doctrine had not changed, it had simply been abandoned in favor of desperation. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to evolve. By Iwo Jima, every Marine squad included at least one man cross-trained on tank-killing techniques. By Okinawa, the bazooka had been supplemented by flamethrowers, satchel charges, and improvised explosive devices that bore no resemblance to anything in the official manual. Each island generated new lessons. Each lesson was shared not through official channels, though those existed, but through the informal networks of men who understood that the difference between life and death lay in learning from yesterday's battle before tomorrow's began. The Type 95 H-AGO had been designed to exploit an enemy's lack of anti-tank weapons. Instead, it encountered an enemy who treated anti-tank warfare as a problem to be solved by anyone with initiative and a weapon. The tank's thin armor, acceptable against Chinese infantry with no anti-tank capability, became a fatal weakness against Marines who carried bazookas as casually as rifles. The speed that had been its advantage in China became irrelevant on islands measured in hundreds of yards, where there was no room to maneuver and no place to retreat. The symbolic weight of those burning tanks extended beyond their tactical defeat. For the Japanese crews, the Type 95 represented the Emperor's will made manifest, a physical embodiment of Japan's military supremacy in Asia. To see them destroyed so easily, so casually, by an enemy who seemed to invent new methods of destruction with each engagement, was to witness the collapse of certainty itself. The Americans did not fight honorably. By Japanese standards, they did not announce their attacks. They did not maintain formation. They did not follow predictable patterns. They fought to win, adjusting their methods as rapidly as battlefield conditions demanded, bound by results rather than doctrine. For the Americans, the bazooka became something more than a weapon. It was proof that individual initiative mattered, that a private from Oklahoma could kill a tank without waiting for artillery support or airstrikes. That survival depended not on following orders, but on solving problems. This was deeply embedded in American culture, the idea that authority could be questioned, that better methods could be found, that the individual possessed agency even within hierarchical structures. The difference between American and Japanese tactical adaptation was not merely military but philosophical, rooted in fundamentally different understandings of how humans should organize themselves to accomplish collective goals. Epilogue. The coral sand of Roynamur Island has long since been cleared of wreckage. The burned-out hulls of Type 95 tanks were pushed into the sea or cut apart for scrap, their steel reborn as peacetime tools. The names of the dead are recorded in archives that few consult, but the lesson remained, encoded in doctrine manuals and staff college lectures, the institutional memory of armies that learned from that brutal Pacific laboratory. The Japanese tank crews who died in the Marshall Islands were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were servants of a system that could not adapt as fast as the enemy killed them. They followed their orders with discipline and courage, and their orders led them into killing zones designed by 19-year-old privates who had never read a tactical manual but understood the immediate problem in front of them with perfect clarity. War is often described as a contest of wills, but it is more precisely a contest of systems which side can observe, decide, and act more rapidly than the other. Which side can incorporate new information without waiting for permission? Which side treats doctrine as a starting point rather than an ending point? The Americans did not win the Pacific because they were braver or more numerous, though both helped. They won because they built a machine of adaptation that operated faster than the enemy could counter, that empowered every level of command to solve problems, that treated yesterday's solution as tomorrow's constraint to be overcome. The bazooka that killed Sergeant Yamamoto's tank was wielded by a private who made a tactical decision in the 3 seconds between seeing the target and pulling the trigger. No officer approved that decision. No manual prescribed that action. It simply worked. And because it worked, it was repeated. And because it was repeated, it became doctrine. This is the true abundance democracy offers, not merely material wealth, though that matters, but an abundance of agency. The permission to think and act and adapt without waiting for authority to grant approval. The Type 95 Hago tanks rusting at the bottom of Pacific lagoons are monuments to what happens when systems cannot learn as fast as the world changes around them. They are evidence that courage alone cannot overcome a faster decision cycle, that discipline without adaptation is merely ritual, that the future belongs to those who can transform themselves more rapidly than their enemies can understand them. In the end, the Japanese tank crews panicked not because they lacked bravery, but because they finally understood what their doctrine had hidden from them, that they were fighting an enemy who treated every battle as an opportunity to become something new, who refused to remain the enemy they had been yesterday, who adapted faster than orders could travel, faster than manuals could be rewritten, faster than Tokyo could comprehend. And in that realization, in those final moments before the bazooka's warhead found its mark, they glimpsed the essential truth that would outlast the war itself. That freedom's greatest weapon is not firepower or numbers, but the permission to change, to question, to adapt, to become whatever the next moment demands.